Hi everyone, I'm Hanovi Schoonover, the Training and Resource Coordinator for Redwind Consulting, and I'd like to welcome you to the webinar. Before we begin, for those who may not know, Redwind is a nonprofit organization that provides tribal technical assistance on a variety of programs, including but not limited to housing and homeless services, children and youth, and elder abuse. This ranges from policy review via email to site visits. If you are interested, you can contact me at the email I will be putting into the chat box. This presentation is not necessarily representative of the views and policies of the DOJ or OVW. All the opinions and recommendations within are those of the authors. Presenting with us today are Lenny Hayes, Honor Fisher, and Mattee Jim. Mattee Jim is of the Zuni people clan and born for the Towering House people clan. This is how she identifies as a Navajo. Mattee has been active in the HIV field for the past 15 years. She has presented at several conferences, such as the International AIDS Conference 2012, the United States Conference on AIDS, and the National HIV Prevention Conference, as well as many others. She is currently employed with the First Nations Community Health Source as a supervisor for HIV prevention programs. Honor Fisher is a member of the Colorado River Indian tribes. She is Mojave and Chemehuevi and lived in the majority of her life on the reservation in Parker, Arizona. She is the Northwest Regional Coordinator and Tribal Liaison for the state of New Mexico. She has worked in victim services for more than 13 years, starting with volunteering with the Urban Indian Advocacy Program in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She received her bachelor's degree in psychology and her certification as a tribal legal advocate, as well as a certification as a trainer in strangulation. Lenny Hayes is an enrolled member of the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate of the Northeast Corner of South Dakota. Lenny is also the owner and operator of Tate Toba Consulting, LLC. He has extensive training in mental and chemical health issues that impact the Two-Spirit and LGBTQ community. Lenny has always worked within the Native American community, which includes the American Indian Family Center in St. Paul, and was a consultant and therapist with the Little Earth of the United Tribes in Minneapolis. He is currently in private practice specializing in Two-Spirit and Native LGBTQ issues with adults and youth. If you have any questions, you can put them into the chat box or raise the hand via the little hand icon. And I will now turn it over to our presenters.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start by asking the questions, and I will have Lenny and Mattee give their answers before we move on to the next question. So the first question that we have is, what barriers have you seen when it comes to reporting sexual abuse or domestic violence in the Two-Spirit LGBTQ community? Lenny, do you want to go first?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. So when we talk about the urban community, specifically, one of the things that I want to mention is that when we talk about urban communities, we also need to understand that urban communities are different in all areas of the country. So it's really important to understand that. So one of the things that I know that has been really difficult for Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ people to report sexual abuse or domestic violence within urban community is because currently I believe that we're still being shunned within community. And so a lot of and then just really understanding that a lot of our Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ people who have migrated from rural or tribal communities and often go to the bigger cities seeking better support or more support, often thinking that a lot of our LGBTQ organizations in urban community are being helpful. But I think one of the biggest issues is that even within these LGBTQ organizations, they don't really understand how to work with Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ people, or more or less just really understand the trauma, the issues that are impacted upon us. I always say, you know, with the Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ people versus, how would you say it, like the national LGBTQ people, our issues are they go much more deeper than what I would say like the national LGBTQ community, if that makes sense. So I'll turn it over to Mattee and see what, I'd like to hear Mattee's thoughts.
Thank you, Lenny. So a couple of things come to mind around this question. So I think the biggest barrier, first and foremost, is self-reporting. A lot of times when sexual assault does happen, it's not being reported because the individual may feel like there's no services to help the population. And I'm talking specifically for trans populations. So self-reporting is the biggest barrier. And then also services that are being provided to a person who's been sexually assaulted, who comes from the community, sometimes may not, the entities or programs that say that they have programs to help our population and say that they're inclusive may not really be inclusive of helping our populations. Another I believe challenge is funding. A lot of times we don't talk about the funding for specific programs in our urban LGBTQ community that addresses sexual assault. So we may have programs that may include or provide some services to our populations, but I think specific funding to a program that reaches out or does work directly with our community, from our community, with our community, is one of the biggest challenges that there are out there. And I think another one is resources, like what resources are out there that people can look into. And sometimes there could only be one, and hopefully like in the future, there could be like 3 or 4 that people can have options of going to services when sexual assault does happen, or even domestic violence.
One of the big things that I've seen as an advocate when it came to seeking help with reporting sexual abuse and domestic violence, when it came to our Two-Spirit LGBTQ community, is that we've seen issues with both being able to seek resources and having trouble with law enforcement being willing to report it as a domestic violence or sexual abuse. Most of the times it was seen more as assault rather than domestic violence, or vice versa. The issues that we were seeing were that it was very, very hard to have people take it seriously when it came to reporting. Go ahead.
Can I add something, Honor? Something just popped in my head while you were speaking. I'm sorry I cut you off. And I think one of the other challenges I see is time and response. I remember taking an individual to the hospital to get seen because sexual assault had happened, and because of the time that was elapsed and waiting for so long, the person decided to leave the hospital without being seen. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges also too, is the wait time for somebody who's gone through the sexual assault or even domestic violence, and having to wait for those services to be provided and stuff. So I think the time that elapsed for this person was like 2.5 hours. So making that decision to leave the hospital. And so looking back at that, especially with the personal experience and dealing with that, for me, it's very frustrating because I was there to support somebody who went through this trauma, and seeing it happen firsthand and trying to encourage the person to stay. But the decision was to leave and leave it. Yeah.
I think with you saying that, it brought up another thing for me. One of the other things that we ran into was funding to provide for services when there was a sexual assault. We would try to get them in to get a rape kit done, and there were arguments over who was going to pay for it, because some of the programs don't have funding that was inclusive for LGBTQ community, and so there was that issue as well.
I think like one of the things that happened that I still think about what happened here in Minneapolis was I was contacted by a Two-Spirit elder because of a male who identified as Two-Spirit in southern Minnesota was raped. And when this elder reached out to me, she wanted to know where he could go for services. Now, knowing at that time here in Minneapolis, there's no such organizations that offer that kind of advocacy work for male survivors. So I did reach out to several Native organizations and did reach out to a Two-Spirit woman who worked for one of these organizations. And what had happened was, because there was a lapse in trying to get him connected to the proper services, it took too long. And so he didn't reach out to any of the organizations. So I think one of the biggest issues is that, you know, some of these organizations do want to help, especially males who identify as Two-Spirit or gay or bisexual. A lot of them don't specifically say they work with male survivors. So that was a huge barrier in trying to get him the proper services that he needed in regards to what he experienced. So I just kind of wanted to throw that in there too, because again, you know, a lot of our organizations don't specifically say that they work with males who identify as, you know, gay, bisexual, or Two-Spirit.
Lenny, can you please answer what Two-Spirit means?
Sure. So I'll give you a really short version. But the term Two-Spirit comes from a group of Native individuals who identified as LGBTQ who met at a third annual conference in Winnipeg. And so we have to remember that there's 570 plus tribes with over 200 languages. So basically these individuals came together to the goal was to step away from that mainstream language of LGBTQ and become more connected to culture and spirituality as Native people. And really having that deep understanding of like the roles that we played in community before colonization. So the term Two-Spirit comes from the Ojibwe language. And what that means is that that individual houses both a male and female spirit. But most importantly, we need to remember that there's a lot of tribes here in the United States, because it is a universal term, but just that understanding that there are tribes in the country who don't use the term Two-Spirit because it has a totally different meaning in their culture. So I always like to remind people, you know, if you come across an individual who's Native who may identify, we should never assume that that person identifies as a Two-Spirit. What we should ask them is, how do you identify? You know, that's a really respectful way of doing this, because again, like I said, you may call someone Two-Spirit and they may not even be connected to that word. So I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Lenny. Second question, what barriers have you faced when seeking resources as a Two-Spirit LGBTQ in urban areas when seeking services? And Mattee, can you answer that first?
Just a clarifying question on top of that. Is it any services or any resources, or is it specific to the two topics we're talking about?
I think it's any resources that that you're seeking when it comes to being able to find resources, period. Okay,
thank you. So some of the barriers that I see and face within our urban setting, I want to say that I'm fortunate to live in a state where that we do have policies, hate crimes bills, and non-discrimination acts and stuff. We do have services that provide resources for our trans community. like the Transgender Resource Center of New Mexico, and we do have Native trans populations or individuals who go to the service and seek services on all levels and stuff. So we're fortunate to have that. I think one of the barriers that I see is that programs throughout the city or even the state sometimes refer just to the resource center rather than taking some initiative to provide services or inclusion of services or reaching out to our population with services. So I'm looking at some of the services that are being provided, and then also linking in, because we're Native, we identify as Native, and we migrate. Sometimes we go back to our reservations, we go back to a rural community, and we migrate back and forth. And sometimes that could be a barrier in seeking services, because with service providers in certain areas, they want you to provide documentations that you're from that area, or you're seeking services within that area or that region, and if you're from somewhere else, that sometimes there could be that barrier of like, okay, we can't help you because you don't have this address, or you're not living in the city, or you're not living in the area, so there's not services being provided to you. So I think that's, for me, that's the biggest barrier that I see. What are the barriers? Specific to Native LGBT Two-Spirit populations, I think like with community gatherings, like here in Albuquerque, we don't really have a place to gather. We see people at events. We don't have like an organization or agency or program that brings together our Native LGBT Two-Spirit community. So I think that's another barrier, is that social connection within our communities.
Lenny?
This is such a huge question. When I think about community here in Minneapolis, I do have to say, like Mattee, I mean, I'm fortunate to live in a state and a city that's really protective of individuals who identify as LGBTQ. What I've noticed in the last probably 5 to 10 years, the term Two-Spirit or even Native LGBTQ has been part of the conversation, when in the past we weren't really a part of the conversation. So we're still in that place of trying to help train like our Native organizations how to, specifically honor and help and support and encourage individuals who identify as Two-Spirit or Native LGBTQ. Which is, it's getting better. I mean, I remember, almost 10 years ago, it wasn't even as good as it is now, right? Because we're starting to have more conversation. We're starting to be inclusive to the population. We're inviting the population to the table. But again, a lot of our relatives who identify as either Two-Spirit or Native LGBTQ are often still afraid to come to the table, because, I mean, and just truly understanding like a lot of the issues that we've experienced, not only in the city, but even, coming from our homelands, coming from our tribal communities, really understanding, the impact of being shunned and unwanted, and then coming to a city, a bigger city, to try to seek those resources, but then having individuals who don't understand us. Or even know how to work with us or support us. Now, when I talk about like, as my professional work that I do, having my own private practice and working with individuals who identify as Two-Spirit or Native LGBTQ, a lot of them have experienced a lot of trauma. So I have found myself going into universities or other organizations training, or even talking with like mental health providers on how to specifically work with individuals who identify. Because again, sometimes we don't even realize, but even our own biases stand in the way of how we help the population. So it's really important that we check our own biases, and for me, understanding that when I do work with individuals who identify both youth, adults, elders, community, that I have to make sure that my own personal stuff that I've healed from doesn't intertwine with the work that I'm trying to do. Because again, if I try to do that, then what ends up happening is then I become, almost dependent on like wanting to always support the community and forgetting to take care of myself. So there has to be a line for me. I mean, I have to make sure that I have some clear, healthy boundaries in what I'm doing, because I do care about my community. I know the struggles and challenges of my community, but I'm also just playing my part in trying to help my community. So I know I was kind of rambling, but I just wanted to say that.
Honor, can I add to that?
Mhm.
Something's just popped in my head again. So for me, I think resources such as housing for our population sometimes is difficult, and I think it's across the board throughout the nation. Also, gender affirming care and surgeries, especially in urban settings, especially if you're Native and you get your healthcare from Indian Health Services and may not be insured with insurance or even some other payment to do healthcare. So that could be another barrier in resources. And this just popped in my head looking at substance use and abuse. With some of our relatives, I've had individuals who had come and say that I need some help. This is what I'm going through, and seeking those services for our population sometimes it's difficult, especially being put on a waiting list or seeking out the services that will help our brothers and sisters get into treatment because they want that. So even in that time frame of waiting, sometimes they fall off the radar, or they go back to what they're wanting to do, and it comes back to that time again, like the amount of time that you have to wait. And sometimes with that amount of time, sometimes you don't want to continue that approach because it took too long to possibly get into or to address it.
And I would definitely have to agree with you, Mattee, that it's very, very hard to get resources both in the rural and in the urban setting for any of our Two-Spirit LGBTQ. It is very, very hard. Mm-hmm. Even when we are just seeking basic services, sometimes that can be a big barrier.
Yeah, and I think even also if they were to get into treatment, how one could be treated or how one could be talked about. I went through that experience where I knew a couple of people didn't like me, and things were said verbally that, looking back on it, it was harassment. So the way one is being treated, because for me, I kind of like brushed it off and stuff, and because I was there for a purpose. But looking back on it, it was that harassment that was happening. It was verbal, mental, and emotional abuse, and not recognizing that until after, years later, when I understood what that was and looking back on that past experience. And sometimes that could also add to the trauma that we go through and stuff, and make it a little bit more difficult when we're wanting to get help and services later on down the road.
A lot of times it is the lack of acceptance and the lack of understanding that poses the biggest barrier when you're seeking resources, because if you're trying to go into treatment, or if you're trying to go into shelter services, if they're not trained on how to work with the Two-Spirit LGBTQ community, then you run into the difficulties of how to work with someone and how to work with people who don't understand how you're identifying and how you're being, how they treat you affects your ability to be in the communities and seeking resources. Those are some of the biggest issues that we see across the board. Just being able to get people who have had training, who understand how we identify, and being able to have them speak to us appropriately is something that seems to be a continuing barrier.
I think too, just to do a follow-up in what I said earlier about the Two-Spirit identity, one of the things I want people to really, really truly understand that it was a concept that was created by Native people and should only be used by Native people who identify. But the other important thing that I want to tell people too is that even though the term Two-Spirit is a universal term, it is viewed differently from tribe to tribe. I really want to stress that because, just from what the person said in the chat box, that her grandmother said that the two-spirit is round like an egg and it moves in all directions, meaning not one spirit direction. I like that analogy, but it's also important to remember that each tribe is different in how they view the term two-spirit. So I wanted to share that really quickly. Thank you.
Next question. What difficulties have you faced as two-spirit LGBTQ in an urban setting and as a Native? Lenny, do you want to go first?
I'm going to have to think about that a little bit. Well, again, I mean, this is such a broad question. So now if we were talking about, like, before I went on my healing journey versus who I am today, before I went on my healing journey, when I moved here 26 years ago to Minneapolis, and I came with a lot of trauma and a lot of issues that I didn't want to face or work through or deal with. I didn't know who to talk to. When I moved here, I learned the term two-spirit and wanted to connect with the community, so I sought out Native individuals who identified just because, to be a part of a community. But it's kind of crazy because I didn't find community until probably 2 or 3 years later when I moved here to the city, where I actively sought out. It was very uncomfortable for me to go to a white clinic or a non-Native clinic or and try to fit in, and just not having a lot of self-worth or having a high self-esteem. I mean, I really struggled trying to fit into places. Now, after my healing journey and today, I guess I'm pretty much loud and proud and not afraid to ask for things that I may need or even to advocate for other individuals. I'm pretty flamboyant. I'm not afraid to say what I need to say. Very supportive of the community. I don't have an issue with challenging people, but in a good way, not in the way that I'm doing it out of anger, but to help sort of get people to think about like some of the things, the difficulties that even I face as a two-spirit male. So yeah, I mean, it's such a huge question. So I guess when I look at that question, that's how I would view it, before my healing journey, and then after my healing journey. So I'll let Mattee jump in.
Thank you, Lenny. So I just wanted to point out that I'm kind of looking like this. My bifocals, I have line bifocals, so I'm not staring you down. It's just I'm trying to focus. So I wanted to add to that conversation. I think the one thing that two things pop in my head is like when I first moved to Albuquerque, like I found a Native AA meeting that I really liked and went to like constantly and stuff. So I think after that kind of like fizzled away and disbanded, like the difficulty for me, especially in somebody who's been sober for a while, is finding a group that I'm comfortable with again. And I really did like the Native group that I went to, especially for my AA meeting. So trying to find something like that or similar, I think is one of the difficulties and resources. And a lot of times feeling uncomfortable and just going to an AA meeting as a trans person, a Native trans person, or even sometimes as a Native person just going into AA meetings, because a lot of times we're stereotyped and labeled, especially when it comes to substance use and abuse. Also, mental health services, I think, is one of the biggest, greatest difficulties is finding the right person to work with. For me, like if I work with somebody who mental health, like I need to click with them, or I want somebody has gone through some of the experiences that I may have gone through that knows, so that way it gives more of a context of like I understand you a lot better. So for me, looking at mental health services, and then just finding the right one, finding that resource, I think has been difficult, especially for me. So I think I'm actively still looking. So I'm going to try to seek those services if I can again. And I think for me also, as a trans person who's working, who understands her privileges and stuff, that I have a vehicle, I have an apartment and stuff, that with some resources, I do have a job that pays the bills and stuff. So some of those difficulties have been dealt with. But seeing others in my population who are going through some of these difficulties and understanding from like unemployment to housing, to all the topics that we talked about, in dealing with some of those, and it could be like an individual case basis too, because the difficulties could be different for a certain person. And I think how to address that and getting the right resources for our population is very beneficial. So I kind of put my own personal experience into some of the work that I do in seeking some of these services.
So, just to follow up on the mental health piece too, I have never worked outside of Native community. I've always worked within Native community. One of the things that I've come across in working with, all Native people, including Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ people, a lot of them have talked about when they would go to a non-Native therapist, it was almost like having to educate them about what it means to be Native, or really get them to understand, a lot of the issues that really impacts our communities. When we talk about abuse, substance abuse, sexual abuse, child trauma, all of that, we are having to educate them. So I think it's really important as mental health providers, especially if you're non-Native, to really it doesn't mean that you're going to know everything about what it means to be Native, but specifically how to work with Native individuals and really understand that, for instance, when I do mental health work with Native people, and if I don't get eye contact, I'm okay with that. Because that's one of the things that often a lot of our Native people don't do, as a form of reciproc, but also the fact that a lot of times we don't have, a very high self-esteem. One of the things that I also talk about too, in regards to being a mental health provider, as long as I've been a mental health therapist for 12 years, my diplomas have never hung on my wall. None of my accomplishments have really hung on my wall, any of them, like any of my diplomas, because one of the things that I talk about is that, when I have working one-on-one with somebody and they come into my, my office and they see all these accomplishments on the wall, how is that going to make them feel? They're not going to feel good about themselves. So I don't do those things because I know, a lot of our Indian people, including our Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ people, they all have a low self-esteem, because of the things that they experienced. So I try to make my space when working with individuals who identify, to make it a very calming and accepting place, a trusting place, and a safe space where they could, talk about the many things that they're struggling with. So that's how I operate as a mental health provider.
So the next question, what do you feel is missing from the current conversation regarding our urban Two-Spirit LGBTQ community? And Mattee, do you want to go first?
I could, thank you. I think I think that would depend on what city that you're in, because I think all of us have different things that are happening and certain things that are missing. Like I said, New Mexico kind of has some really good policies and stuff that's happening within our state that people can get resources and stuff. But I think the overall conversation I feel that people are missing is including our population. Even within LGBTQ communities, a lot of times Native LGBTQ people are left out. And I think one of the biggest things that I've thought of and actually heard is that people feel that Native populations, their tribe will take care of them, including our Native LGBTQ communities, our Two-Spirit communities, where like our tribes will take care of us, we're taken care of and we're looked after, which is not true. So within different sectors, especially in the native urban settings, there are resources and services where I think there can be much more inclusion of our populations, and not just say it, but actually document it and having it in writing. Because a lot of times when they say they include trans populations or native trans populations, sometimes I have to question it, like to what degree is it just adding the T or just adding the word trans and really providing those services. So I think the biggest thing that I want to say is that just the inclusion of our populations is missing.
And I do have to, I mean, I agree with Mattee in regards to like, it all depends on like what city we live in. You know, we're pretty lucky and fortunate here in Minnesota to have a lieutenant governor who identifies as Native. And again, too, I mean, I agree with Mattee that a lot of times, a lot of our Native people who identify or even just simply Native, you know, there's that thinking that our tribes are going to help us, right? But that doesn't always often work that way, you know, because often sometimes our individuals who identify as Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ, they leave their homelands to go to a bigger city to sort of escape, you know, whatever trauma that they may have experienced, or, you know, trying to heal, trying to get better, whatever, or seek better resources for themselves. But it doesn't always work out that way. I guess one of the biggest struggles that I have both nationally is when we talk about the MMIW or MMIP or MMIR. Often what becomes an issue too is that a lot of our Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ people are never included or invited to the table to have these conversations. So we usually have, which is a good thing, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but we have these movements who are speaking for us. And really what they should be doing is inviting us to the table. And often sometimes when we think about the, you know, one of the things that I personally and professionally talk about when I present is that, you know, we as Indian people, when we think about healing, we shouldn't just think about one gender. We should think about all genders, including males, Two-Spirit people, females. You know, that's who we are as Indian people. And I think we need to do more of that. And I don't think we're doing enough of it. So those are my thoughts. I mean, I can go on and on about this, but I'll turn it over to Honor.
Can I add to that again, Lenny?
Yes.
Thank you for saying that and bringing up MMIWR. So like I said, it's specific, and I think this example gives evidence to what we're talking about, is that each city is different. In our state, I did apply to be a part of the task force for MMIWR, which was accepted. So I got a letter saying that I'm going to be part of the task force in the group, which is great and wonderful. So that way we have a seat at the table and give our expertise, especially as Native trans populations, because I've had relatives who've been murdered and stuff. So being a part and having a seat at the table is great, but other cities may not have that, or other states may not have the opportunity. But I think this is a start where the inclusion of one state is great, is good, but it'd be great to have several states, or even all states, have somebody from our Native LGBTQ Two-Spirit have a seat at the table with a lot of the programs that are being provided on the national level.
So now I would like to open up questions from all of the people attending the webinar. And I do have one question. How can domestic violence and sexual assault response providers reach out to the Native LGBTQ Two-Spirit community?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I think the first thing that comes to mind in doing outreach to our community is finding the community and saying that you do have the services that are being provided there. One of the things that we do in our trainings across the board is talking about literature in office spaces or paperwork that is inclusive of our population, even advertisement or social media that says that you are working with the population, you're inviting the population to the program, or if you have any resources where somebody can call in or refer someone who is of our population could be referred to, and having that contact and information. So I think there's a couple of layers to this. Like I said, the social media, the paperwork, especially the paperwork. And I think the number one thing is the inclusiveness, or how do we welcome our populations that you want to get into your services. And word of mouth is really good, especially within our Native communities, because we go and we talk and we tell people what's going on. And if your services are really good, other people are going to tell other people about your services and where they can go for it.
So one of the things that I noticed here in the Minneapolis area, just recently I went and did a training for an organization. And one of the things that they're working on right now is developing a specific program for individuals who identify as Two-Spirit or Native LGBTQ, with that understanding that they know often sometimes our Two-Spirit people don't even really trust our people who identify as straight. Just because of like really truly understanding how much biases really impacts our community. When you have these personal biases against individuals who identify, of course they're not going to trust you. But one of the things that I keep reminding people, like, in order to actively get individuals from the community to accept your services is creating a safe space for them. If you're not creating a safe space for them, then they're not going to come. Also, the reality of it is that, like Mattee said, putting out all these, things that shows that you support the community is important, but also just being included in the language. That's what I always like to say when we talk about domestic violence or sexual assault, that you're supporting individuals who identify is really helpful too. But again, sometimes I always say too that we do a better job in urban communities, but we're not doing well in tribal or rural communities in regards to helping the community. So that's really important to understand that, because again, in the urban community, there is often more services and support for individuals. But you think about the rural and tribal communities, there's not a lot of support.
Speaking from my own experience, I can tell you that one of the biggest things that I see as a barrier when it comes to including people in the conversation is making sure that when you do have them come into your space and making it a safe space is good, but making sure that you have people who are making people feel included is an important thing. Lenny touched on that, but one of the biggest hurdles that I find is when people are coming in, there is judgment in there. There is that feeling of being looked down on. And a lot of times there is that barrier that you come into because people are not necessarily comfortable with talking with the LGBTQ community. And so that tends to make things harder for us to be included in conversations when somebody is not willing to be open and honest. And so that makes it even harder for us when we're trying to be part of a conversation. So making sure that people who are there are willing to be open to having the conversations be there and be inclusive is a big part of that.
I think like one of the barriers too is like not the proper data that's being collected in regards to when we talk about sexual assault or domestic violence. One of the things that I've been advocating, not only in my community here in Minnesota, but across the country, is that when organizations or individuals is collecting data, often they don't ask the proper questions in how the person identifies. So a lot of times, a lot of the sexual assaults, domestic violence that we experience as Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ people is never properly collected. So what happens is like the things that we experience is often included in the mainstream LGBTQ data. So again, a lot of our communities, a lot of our organizations, a lot of our tribes, they don't believe that we're experiencing these things because it doesn't show the proper data, right? So I know that seems to be a huge issue, not only here in Minnesota, but at a national level. And I'm sure Mattee has a lot to say about data also.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up data, because I was actually looking at the US Trans Survey 2015, which I'm not sure if people are familiar with that survey that was done. There was like over 27,000 participants who filled it out, who identified as transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming. And it showed statistics. They did the subgroups of American Indian, Alaska Native, and within those statistics, they said 65% of American Indian, Alaska Native populations experience sexual assault some point in their lifetime, compared to the 47% of the overall survey that was done. And out of that, 17% were sexually assaulted in the past year. So those statistics are alarming, especially within our community. It's like 65%. And also in the survey, it talked about sexual assault from K to 12. So questions were asked, and I believe 13% of the overall executive summary stated that 13% were sexually assaulted in school. And this is K through 12. So my thought is, as a native trans person, like, how is this reported? Did they report that? And unfortunately, the answer is probably no. And so looking at sexual assault, and this is just sexual assault, we have to also factor in domestic violence and also intimate partner violence and experiencing that. And even like reporting some of those challenges or those issues that we go through, or those traumas that we go through. Like, I experienced intimate partner violence and had to report it to the police. And I felt uncomfortable at taking that first step, but I'm glad I did it. And I was thankful that I had an officer who was compassionate and asked the right questions, and also used the right pronouns for me and stuff. So addressing some of those issues. So there's a lot of factors into this, especially coming into data. Like, where do we get our data to supplement some of the stuff that we can utilize for our programs to give evidences? This is why we need it and to serve this population.
Well, thank you, Mattee, for being vulnerable and, talking about your own experiences. But two, one of the things that this happened way back in the, the early 2000s when, I wasn't healed or on a healing journey or whatever, but I too experienced rape. And when my roommate wanted me to report it to the police, I told him no because I was fearful of how I was going to be treated by the police, being a male survivor being raped by another male. So again, I think, even just being a male who experienced, sexual assault or even domestic violence, a lot of times, for me, it was the fear of how I was going to get treated by the police, especially if you have male officers who are interviewing you, and how intimidating that could be, So, I mean, those are some things to think about too. And one of the things too is that, I have a colleague who identifies as a two-spirit woman who did some research in regards to, some of our domestic violence shelters in the country. There's probably less than 5 organizations in the United States. Now, I'm not talking tribal, but I'm talking like organizations that actually has programming for males who identify who experience domestic violence. There's very few services across the country that provides for male survivors. So that's another thing to think about too, because, I think everybody has this idea of, a male who identifies often, we go to that thinking of that person being feminine, when really that's not true. We may have a two-spirit male who's very masculine, but maybe experiencing domestic violence. So we have all these thoughts that we think about, and that's where we need to challenge our biases, and we need to change the way that we think, right? So that's part of the conversation. Now you're getting me going. But anyway, I just want to throw that in too.
Another question, can you talk about the importance of programs considering the ways they might be excluding non-binary and trans Indigenous people?
I think first and foremost is paperwork. A lot of times documentation, when I look at applications or any type of paperwork, it's always, are you male or female? So for somebody who is identifying either non-binary or even trans, like what are we going to mark? So I think the 2-part question and changing those documentation to be inclusive, like your sex assigned at birth, male, female, or intersex. We're even leaving out the intersex community too, because some person can be born intersex. The second part question would be like, what gender identity do you identify? Male, female, trans woman, trans man, or even trans masculine, trans feminine, non-binary, gender non-conforming, gender variant, and also giving options. And a lot of times we like to put the word other and box other. Let's not do that. that's not other. My response is always like put additional and then a line so that people, if they identify differently, they could write that in also too. And a lot of times with data collection and evaluation, sometimes they say that's not an option, but how are we going to get the correct data if we don't give those options to individuals who identify? So we're not being sensitive to somebody's identity and how they identify. So I think documentation is first and foremost. And then after that comes like, what type of services are you providing? And then also, are you asking the right questions? Like within healthcare, sometimes with trans populations, there could be like the wrong pronouns. There could be like when I go to the hospital, sometimes I'm asked about periods. So I don't have periods. I'm a trans woman. I was born male and I live as female now, or stuff. Or do you have kids? And when was the last pregnancy test? Those questions are still asked and stuff. So I think just asking the appropriate questions, and then I think really looking at the documentations if you have it on how one identifies if they come in to your program. Yeah.
I think too, I mean, it's also important to remember, because I'm very like personal, but also this is how I believe, but just really understanding too that sometimes a lot of our Native people who identify as Two-Spirit or Native LGBTQ, often, you know, some of us don't use pronouns. I'm one that doesn't use pronouns. I have my own personal opinion about that. But again, you know, often sometimes we don't respect people who either use them or don't use them. So really truly understanding, you know, that there are people like me who don't use pronouns. I mean, call me Lenny, I'm a human being. If you want to talk about me in a sentence, it's okay to use he, him, and his. But the reason why I don't use pronouns is because I believe it's a form of colonization. Because I have that deep traditional spiritual aspect that I've gotten from elders within my own community, but also understanding too that not all tribal communities or Native communities think the way that I do. So I want to make sure that I want people to understand that. But again, you know, like Mattee, I don't like the word other. And so when I'm talking with organizations or working with domestic violence shelters or whatever, I always tell them to stay away from that word other, because it almost seems like when you use other, like you're dehumanizing that person. So I always tell people to stay away from that. And again, I like, you know, Mattee's idea of using the word additional with the line. And I usually tell people just leave a line and allow them to write in who they are. So that's really important. So I'm glad Mattee brought that up also.
I think one of the ways that programs really do a disservice to themselves is by not having the ability to help our LGBTQ communities. Sorry, my brain just kind of went blank. When we don't allow them to identify, it limits us in the ability to use our data. And so then we have the issues of not having the appropriate data when it comes to reporting. And so then you run into those issues of not being able to look at ways to increase your ability to help the LGBTQ community. And a lot of times, because of that, we lack the availability of current data that can help us to expand the ability to create more resources for the LGBTQ community. And I think for a lot of us, that is a disservice.
Another thing I want to add also too is if you have like funding or you're inclusive of LGBTQ communities, hire us. Have somebody who identifies, be a part of staff, to be a part of the organization or agency. Example that I can give is like, what if you have a trans clinic where you don't have any trans people at the front desk or in a nursing profession or even a doctor profession, and you're being a trans clinic. So where are the trans people that are being hired to be inclusive? And I think it goes across the board with all programs too. If you're going to include our Native LGBTQ Two-Spirit community, have somebody who identifies as employed or hired or be a part of, even as board membership or leadership and stuff. So, yeah.
Do we have any other questions?
Don't be shy, that's why we're here.
Lenny, Mattee, do you have anything else that you want to include?
I think we talked a lot and pretty much about everything that I wanted to talk to. So I'm comfortable and good for what we talked about today.
Well, you know, one of the things that I to give a much deeper understanding to maybe individuals who identify as straight, to sort of think about the many struggles and challenges that, you know, Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ people experience. is often sometimes I always like to remind people, or even just make that statement to people, is why do we always have to defend who we are? Why do we always have to defend our identity? And as straight people, I don't see straight people having to defend their identity. So, and I mean that in a good way, but also just getting people to think about, you know, all of the many struggles and challenges that we have to face. In reality, you know, if you really think about it, people who identify, you know, before colonization, we were treated with the utmost respect and honor in our tribal communities. And now we're looked down upon, and we lost that understanding of, like, what I understand and know is that this identity, or however word that is used in your language, there was a spiritual part of that. I mean, you were considered a spiritual being. Now today we're looked upon as sexual beings. We're looked upon as being bad, you know, and all of this. So I always like to say that to people, just, you know, to sort of get them to really deeply think about it. And I like that Mattee also said too, you know, I'm privileged too, because I know that a lot of my people who identify, you know, some are living on the streets. Some of them don't have food. I have a home, I have food, I have a car, you know, so I have to stop and think, you know, practice that humility and really sort of like understand there is people out there who are far worse than I am. So that's a lot to think about.
Well, actually, I want to add two things. Thank you, Lenny, for talking about that. So I think even understanding the privilege, but also we have biases too within our communities. Like I have biases on certain things. We're human. And then also the fact that our experiences are our experiences as individuals. So whoever you're working with at that time, their experience is different than somebody else who you're going to work with. So I think what I'm saying is, like, really watch stigmatizing or stereotyping people or individuals in certain groups or coming from certain groups, because I kind of see that a lot too. Like with, oh, trans people are like this, or gay people are like this, bi people are like this, lesbians are like this, or two-spirit people are like this. So there's always that generalization where stigma comes from. And it goes back to what Lenny had mentioned of like that colonization and where do we learn these things? I tell people in trainings that hate is learned. So our population is hated because that's where they learn it from other people, and so exhibited on us. So what we're trying to do is changing those perspectives. Even as a trans woman, like I didn't identify as trans at first. The only word that was around was gay. The closest was transsexual, but I identify with that. I didn't hear transgender until the late 90s, and I identified with that. And as it progressed, there was more gender identities. So being into those subgroups or those gender identities, we're given those options. So I think as we continue, we're always going to have that buffet of options. It's what we pick from and what we eat from that we're going to utilize. Same way with providing services. What buffet of options do you have to give to the population that you say you're going to serve? And not just be one specific meal for that group, but giving them an option also too, and what services to be provided. Does that sound?
Yeah, I mean, following up with Mattee, you know, I may appear feminine, but I'm really butch. Just kidding. I'm kidding. I just have to put that laughter in there. Mattee, don't say anything.
Well, I would like to go ahead and turn it back over to Redwind. If there are no other questions, I'd like to thank everyone who joined us today. And thank you to Lenny and Mattee.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you all. Before we end the session, I want to let you all know that there will be an eval popping up once Zoom closes. We'd love to hear what you thought, so if you're able to fill that out, we'd very much appreciate it. Really quick, there's a question or comment that just popped up. All right. In closing, I'd like to thank our presenters, Mattee, Honor, and Lenny. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. I hope you all stay safe, and I hope to see you all at the next webinar. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm